Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. This week, we are beginning our discussion of the 2017 book, Basic Income, a Radical Proposal for a Free Society and a Sane Economy by Philippe von Parijs and Yannick Vanderborght. So this book, I would say, it kind of gives the best description of the mainstream thinking on basic income. And Philippe von Parijs is actually, his writing is where I first heard the term basic income back in 2011. He had written some chapters in a book compiled by Eric Olin Wright. He had this series of real utopias, and this book was called Redesigning Distribution. So that's where I first heard the term basic income, and then since then, I've read a bunch of other stuff by Van Parijs, including we had a discussion here on Boston Basic Income about an article he wrote with Robert Vanderborght in 1986 called Capitalist Road to Communism. So if you're interested in more of what he has to say, I encourage you to check that out. So we're going to start today. We're going to be doing it chapter by chapter. The first chapter of the book is called The Instrument of Freedom. So we can ask the question to what extent it's useful to describe basic income through the lens of freedom. Does it make sense to frame basic income as a central pillar of free society? That's kind of the language that they use. And in this book, they kind of take it as the most fundamental thing is that you want a society that's as free as possible, that the poorest people are as free as possible. And we can ask the question whether that's the right lens to look at basic income through, or whether it's the most useful lens through which we can look at basic income. So I want to start with a quote from the book. Let me pull that up here. Here we go. Oops. Do share screen. To rebuild confidence and hope in the future of our societies, in the future of our world, we shall need to subvert received wisdom, shake our prejudices, and learn to embrace radical ideas. One of these, simple but crucial, is that of an unconditional basic income, a regular cash income paid to all on an individual basis without means test or work requirement. So I think there's a lot in this book that we'll get into that I think is problematic in how they talk about basic income. But something they get really right, is the definition. And when I say right, I don't mean like, okay, you can define words however you want, right? Or you can define terms however you want. And there's, a lot of different meanings of basic income that can seem valid. But when I say right, I mean useful. I mean useful for kind of understanding something. There are some definitions of basic income that include, like it has to be a certain amount or something, but that kind of muddies the discussion. If you just think of it as this mechanism where everyone gets money, the same amount on an individual basis unconditionally, then you can isolate a concept there and think about that on its own, and then bring in separate discussions about, okay, what's the appropriate level, that kind of thing. So I really like this definition of basic income. This is the first definition that I was exposed to because I was actually reading Van Parijs when I found the term basic income, and I really think this is the most useful definition to approach it through. So they use the term radical here. I like to think of that means kind of getting to the root, radical, right? Root, like radishes. Get to the root of kind of what we want out of our society, what we want out of our economy. So if you go back to the root, you can kind of maybe drop some notions about kind of your assumptions about how things are supposed to work, that kind of thing. Really get to just whittle down to the fundamentals of what do we want from our economy, what do we want are people to be experiencing in the world, or what, you know, like what outcomes do we want? And they, of course, are emphasizing freedom. That's not necessarily what I would emphasize, but it's their starting point here. And even though I do have a lot of problems with this book, including in this chapter, I do think it's the best book there is on basic income, which is a little bit, it's a little bit sad, because I really care about basic income, and I wish there were more better resources out there, but hopefully we can build those in the coming years. So let's get to another quote here. So there's a lot of attitudes in this book that I really appreciate, including the idea of kind of intellectual honesty and acknowledging, you know, kind of what the different sides are saying. And they really make a strong effort to do all of that. So this next quote is also from the prologue. Yes, a better world is possible, and in order to achieve it, it is necessary to be imaginative and enthusiastic. But intellectually honest discussion that does not elude inconvenient facts and embarrassing difficulties is just as indispensable. This is the collective effort this book invites you to join. So I think I really appreciate this sentiment and this approach, and I always try to stay intellectually honest when talking about basic income, or really any of this stuff. You know, there's a difference between winning an argument because you just kind of shut the other person down, and actually kind of building understanding with people you disagree with and with opposing viewpoints. So I like this approach. I'll go to the next one here. I'm still sharing, so you guys are seeing how the sausage is made. Whoops, or failed to be made. There we go. A basic income is not just a clever measure that may help alleviate urgent problems. It is a central pillar of a free society in which the real freedom to flourish through work and outside work will be fairly distributed. It is an essential element of a radical alternative to both old socialism and neoliberalism, of a realistic utopia that offers far more than the defense of past achievements or resistance to the dictates of the global market. It is a crucial part of the sort of vision needed to turn threats into opportunities, resignation into resolution, anguish into hope. So I think this is this kind of language is very evocative and kind of, you know, I don't know, visionary or something like that. I tend to think of basic income as something more mundane. It's just kind of a way of getting people money, and it's a normal way of getting people money that we happen to be missing, which causes kind of all these problems. And they're more, I think, emphasizing that the world is changing, and in order to kind of harness the benefits of those changes, you need like something new and different, and basic income is the something new and different. Whereas I would say that the absence of basic income and the problems that it causes are not new, and they've been with us for centuries. Yeah, go ahead, Bethany.
Yeah, I thought, since we've had a couple quotes on this idea of focusing on freedom, I thought you might want to say a little bit more about why you don't take that focus, or what you think that focus is lacking. You know, what was that focus?
Yeah. So I don't think it's wrong to say that basic income helps with freedom. It certainly does. I think when the way you get people money in your society is broken, it causes a lot of problems, including unnecessarily limiting people's freedom. So I think freedom is just kind of one angle you can look at basic income through, and it's not the most fundamental aspect of it. It's not the, if you want to use their terms, it's not the most radical way to think about basic income. The most radical way of thinking about basic income is also the most boring way of thinking about basic income, which is just that any market economy needs a mechanism to get money to consumers. And what's that mechanism going to be? If you choose the wrong one, then it prevents your economy from reaching its full potential, and it prevents your people from reaping the full benefit of the economy. Yeah. so that's why I don't choose freedom as my starting point when thinking about basic income. It's certainly an aspect of it. When you break the way people get their money, you break freedom, and you break all kinds of other things as well.
It seems like a lot of people approach the discussion of basic income from the perspective of something that it's going to gain you, and so like that, from your perspective, I guess they're always having to then pick one of the many things that it's going to gain you. But I can also see why that's an intuitive approach to starting. Usually you want to think about why you should make a change because of the benefits that it's going to bring. So it makes sense that people are focused on that, whether it be alleviating poverty or freedom or any of the other ones.
Yeah, it does make intuitive sense, and I think that's right. Unfortunately, in the case of basic income, the benefits it provides are myriad, right? There's a ton of them, and they're also really complicated. So if you try to understand it through that angle, you're going to go down a lot of different paths and get into a lot of really complicated stuff. Some of it's interesting, but it's not as simple as recognizing that, okay, your car is, the engine is missing something or something like that, right? And it's like, oh, we got to fix that. Of course, like you can say, oh, if we have a properly functioning engine, then this car will be able to do all kinds of great stuff that it couldn't do before. But that's a little more complicated to explain than saying, hey, your engine is broken, you need to fix it.
But I guess if nobody thinks you need an engine, it becomes a more complicated task to explain why it's broken in the first place.
Right. So first you have to explain to them like what this car is and what it's supposed to do, and say like, hey, I know you really like this car and what it's doing for you now, and you have some complaints about things that you'd like to be better, but really your car is broken, and you could have a car that functions and you could drive places no problem. Yeah. So yeah, we kind of have to go through that process of it's a two-step process. Of first you have to explain what's broken and then explain how to fix it. But I still think that's a lot simpler than just, like going around and selling people on the benefits of having an engine in your car or a properly functioning engine in your car. Like, oh, it gets you this and that and that. Yeah. So I feel like freedom is one of those things. It's one of those things that a properly functioning money distribution system gets you. Of course, it's in the sense that it gets you freedom. I mean, it's not, your money system is not unnecessarily taking away from people's freedoms. There's always limits to how free people can be. You just don't want to make those limits more restrictive than they need to be. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to sort of speak to that by saying, the amount of freedom that you can get to some extent depends on the amount of money that you can afford to give people, right, in the basic income. So it's going to depend on other factors in your economy and society and how prosperous you're able to be or how you trade off time and material prosperity or other factors like that. So yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
It's not like you can, in any conditions, just implement basic income and people will be like maximum freedom.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't have very many resources, like the effects of fixing the economy is only going to benefit you so far as you have the resources to benefit people, that kind of thing. A properly functioning economy allows you to get the most out of what our potential is. It doesn't necessarily increase that potential, although it can, because then if people know that the full potential of the economy is going to be activated, that creates an incentive for people to invest in more capacity and building more resources for people in the future, more capital.
I guess I'm just partly bringing it up because some people think of its freedom as being like something like Karl Oedipus' power to say no, or like you have enough to survive and so you don't have to do certain things if you don't want to. And I do think we could afford that level of freedom, but like technically there's an assumption there that you can afford that level of basic income. And if your society was like very destitute or something, you might not be.
Well, to be fair, I don't think Van Parijs and Yannick Vanderborght are making the assumption that the basic income can be a certain level. I think they're being pragmatic about it. They're saying like certain things are realistic. And I think they understand that freedom is a continuum, that, it's not worth doing unless you cross some certain threshold of freedom and then, like it works or something like that. Yeah.
And I'm sure like Karl would say the same thing too. Like,
yeah. It's more, and I don't know if they would frame it like this, but I think it's more, we're getting less freedom than we could be getting in a properly functioning economy. Yeah. So let's look at the next one here. We live in a new world remade by many forces, the disruptive technological revolution brought about by the computer and the internet, by the computer and the internet, okay. The globalization of trade, migration, and communication, a fast-growing worldwide demand running up against the limits imposed by a shrinking pool of natural resources and the saturation of our atmosphere, the dislocation of traditional protective institutions, from the family to labor unions, state monopolies, and welfare states, and the explosive interactions of these various trends. So I think there's a sense in which we're always living in a new world, right? The world is constantly changing, but there's a sense in which we're not, right? I think there's a sense in which, you know, if we had basic income 200 years ago or more during the Industrial Revolution, right? You know, there would be a lot fewer dislocations during those events or during those periods, and you'd still have the same problem. The same problem is still there, that you don't have an efficient way of distributing money to people, and then that causes all these distortions and kind of the labor market and all these other things. Is, you know, like people are fighting for wages, which is a weird thing if you just think about wages as an incentive for people to work. But of course, it makes sense if you're thinking of wages as the source of people's income. So you get all these like labor movements and weird stuff like that. So we've had opportunities in the past, and you know there are bigger disruptions and times of relative calm and how things are changing and that kind of stuff. But we've seen there have been points of tension in our history where we could have responded with basic income hypothetically, and we didn't. And it's possible that we won't this time either. Part of what concerns me about the kind of people emphasizing, oh, there's something new and different, is that I think it makes people feel like, well, maybe basic income is obvious, or maybe it's inevitable because the world is changing and this is the solution. But we've been here before and we haven't done basic income before. And we could easily make the same mistake again. We could easily do something like a job guarantee or you know, just overstimulating the financial sector to create private sector jobs. And you know we've done this before, and we can kind of keep going. We can keep limping along in this state, and it's a state in which people are not maximally free and not maximally prosperous. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking with this that it can seem like a more, on the face of it, it can seem like a more plausible argument to say that we should change something really big in our society because big things are changing in our society. Like, I think that's one of the reasons that it's appealing to draw attention to things that are changing as a reason for implementing a basic income. It's a bit of a harder sell to say, like, actually, this is something that's been wrong with the economy for the last several hundred years, and just so happens that all the incredibly smart people working on the economy, like most of them at least, didn't think about it. And it never got implemented, but like it really should have been. Like that's not necessarily wrong, but I think that's a little bit less plausible on the surface for a lot of people. And so I think that's one of the reasons that this like change-based argument seems more appealing. So for example, like automation, you know, is automating away jobs, and so therefore like we need to have a basic income. You know, even though things seem to be working okay before, you know, that doesn't mean we don't need a basic income because of this change. Like that just seems like a more plausible argument to a lot of people, I think. Than your argument. I'm not saying your argument is wrong, but I'm pointing out like why I think the attraction might be there to this style of argument and why you see it.
Yeah, and you're bringing up an important puzzle, which is if basic income was always important, then why haven't we done it before, right? Why didn't we figure this out? And I don't have a satisfying answer to that question. I do know that, you know, in the Great Depression, when John Maynard Keynes came along, he saw it as a problem of involuntary unemployment, that we weren't employing people fully. And that was kind of the beginning of modern macroeconomics. So it was kind of started, it kind of got on this path, and we got stuck on this path of thinking about employment, unemployment, and wages and all of that kind of tied together with demand. You know, the demand in the economy is determined by, you know, people's incomes, which are determined by their wages and that kind of thing. And we've kind of been in that since then. It doesn't explain why he went straight to unemployment instead of saying, okay, people, need money. They don't have enough money, and that's why the businesses are failing, because people don't have the money, or they're not spending the money, and then the businesses fail. And ordinarily that's fine to let businesses fail, but people wanted to be able to buy the things that those businesses would have produced, and they would have benefited from that, right? And you could even argue that they needed some of that stuff, like some of it was food and other, important resources. So yeah, people needed money during the Great Depression. They didn't need jobs.
But jobs were already the way that people were getting their money. So isn't the question really like why that was already the way people were getting their money? Because once you have that, it makes sense that it's more natural to think of that as the problem.
Yeah, I mean, if you start, if you just keep going back in history and jobs are always the way that people get their money, how do you break out of that cycle? And I think if you try to compensate for people not getting enough money through jobs by having like these conditional welfare programs and stuff like that, then people will think of those things as exceptional, as not the normal thing. So they'll still think of jobs as the normal way that people get their money. And you're just patching up the existing system and kind of confirming the idea of how it's supposed to work, that people get their money through jobs.
And maybe one more thing to say about this is that giving people money through jobs doesn't require large-scale cooperation in the same way that something like a basic income would. So you can have that, theoretically with a weak state, you could still have individuals who have money kind of to some degree giving other people money, or you can have black markets, right? You can have labor black markets.
Well, I think
whereas a basic income requires a centralized authority that's functioning decently well. And so that's always harder to do.
Well, I think we need to separate the ideas of paying wages as an incentive for people to work, and paying wages as just using that as a tool to give people money, which is something that happens indirectly through monetary policy. So this is still a government thing, right? That we're pushing money to people. I was
thinking of that, but that's kind of like a secondary thing on top of jobs. So if we're looking historically at how this happens, fundamentally jobs don't, just any labor being paid for doesn't require the same kind of centralized stuff. So yes, later you have these things added on to kind of try to tweak it and make it fit and allow people to have the money you want them to have in society, but that develops kind of on top of a system that didn't require as much centralized cooperation to get going in the first place. Yeah,
I think that's right.
You also the more you have excess prosperity, the more you benefit from a basic income, right? The more basic income you're going to be able to afford. So the bigger percentage of your economy it's going to be. So that also, right? That also has to do with how.
Well, yeah, sort of. I mean, it's kind of a chicken egg thing, right? Because you can't have your maximum prosperity without the basic income. So. And I think, I think it's hard to imagine an economy where having a basic income wouldn't make a huge difference, not just in terms of the amount of money, but in terms of how we try to manage the economy and what people expect from the economy and that kind of thing. I guess I'm having trouble imagining a scenario in which I guess the economy is so small that the basic income wouldn't make a very big difference or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on how small and tapped out you are, how much you desperately need people's labor, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Certainly in smaller scale economies. I guess you don't have, in a really small scale society, you're not going to have monetary incentives so much as you're going to have social incentives. So yeah, Austin is bringing up in the chat where there is already hyperinflation. Yeah, I mean, I still think basic income can be an important ingredient to fixing the hyperinflation as well, because you can have a very small basic income and then tighten all your monetary policy and everything like that without worrying about screwing people over excessively. You can have, sometimes, governments feel like they're stuck when they're in hyperinflation. They have to pump more money into the economy to compensate for the rising prices. And then you have this hyperinflationary cycle. Whereas if you had a basic income, then there would be less of this kind of trap that policymakers fall into of having to compensate for the rising prices. Certainly, if your economy can only sustain a very small amount of output for your people, then you do have to admit that your people are going to be poor. But it's better to be poor and not having hyperinflation than being poor and having hyperinflation and not having your money work properly, which is going to make you poorer in the end anyway. So I think in a hyperinflationary scenario, a basic income is going to make a huge difference, especially if it ends the hyperinflation or if it's an important step towards ending the hyperinflation, because that's a really broken economy that you have there if you have hyperinflation. So let's go to the next one. Where the level of remuneration is and remains firmly protected by minimum wage legislation, collective bargaining, and a generous unemployment insurance, the result tends to be massive losses of jobs. So he's talking about technological advancement, what happens in response to that. Where such protections are or become weaker, the results tend to be dramatic increases in the number of people having to scrape by, doing precarious jobs that pay miserable wages. So I think there's another option that can possibly combine with these other two, which is that the result is that we compensate through monetary policy to create more jobs in the private sector. And that basically means you're wasting people's time in combination with pushing more money out to them. But obviously there are some people still going to be left behind, or some people losing their jobs, that kind of thing too. But I like to say that the level of employment in the economy is not determined by how much labor we need. It's determined by how employed we want people to be, or it's largely affected by that. So our policy is determining the employment level, not our need for labor in the market or something like that. So your technology can get 1,000 times as advanced as it is now. And if you have these pro-employment macroeconomic policies, maybe you'll see, depending on how you're implementing those policies, if it's monetary policy or fiscal policy and how it's distributed, that kind of thing, some people are going to get screwed over, distribution of different things is going to change. But all in all, you're not going to see employment levels drop. And you're not necessarily going to see average wage levels drop either, because you're kind of propping up the wages and the labor market in this way that's kind of distorting it away from efficiency. Yeah. So let's. Neil says in the chat he disagrees in hyperinflation. He says that in hyperinflation your basic income would become negligible. Well, it depends, right? So if you set the basic income at some arbitrary level and then decide to tighten your monetary policy enough to end the hyperinflation, then that level of basic income is then going to, the price level will adjust to make that level of basic income. I'm not going to say high or sufficient to kind of make everyone okay, but it will adjust to the point where it's the kind of the maximum level of basic income your economy can sustain, and people will have maximum access to the resources in the economy, and then your markets can reestablish themselves, right, based around whatever that new stable price level is. Obviously, you can't just implement the basic income and not do anything else. You have to decide that, oh, now that we have a basic income, it's okay to stop the hyperinflation. It's okay to tighten monetary policy, or introduce a new currency that we're keeping stable or something like that. So the basic income on its own is not going to end the hyperinflation, but it's certainly compatible with ending the hyperinflation, and it makes it easier to make the kinds of decisions you need to make to end the hyperinflation. Yeah, as Austin says, it allows you to abandon even more inflationary policies. If the amount of the basic income is so small because of the hyperinflation, then maybe the effect of allowing you to make these political decisions is fairly small, or maybe even negligible in some cases, in which case it's not going to help you. But if you had the basic income in the first place, maybe you wouldn't have fallen into the hyperinflationary spiral. It's a lot easier to prevent hyperinflation than it is to end it once it's started, or before it's kind of run its course and everything is ruined. Yeah. So let's see. Okay, we'll go to the next one here. In the past, while some jobs were lost, others were created. The fact that goods could be produced with less work was offset by an increase in the amount of goods produced. An automaker, having found a way to make cars with only a fourth of the workers required before, simply made 4 times more cars. Labor-saving technical change, it is argued, is not a calamity, but a blessing if higher productivity shows up in economic growth. Rising production levels can be relied on to keep providing good jobs and thereby decent incomes to the bulk of the population, whether directly through their wages or indirectly through social benefits to which they are entitled by virtue of these wages. So this is an interesting point. If you get more productive and everyone's income stays the same, then people are going to lose their jobs. The level of employment is going to go down, wages are going to go down. It has to be that way because your businesses are receiving the same income from consumer spending, but they're paying less to workers. So if you hold income fixed and increase productivity, then wages have to go down. Obviously, in order for this to be a realistic scenario, something has to compensate for the wages, for the income lost in the wages. But if people's incomes are coming from wages entirely, then you have a little bit of a feedback loop there where the lower employment leads to lower wages, leads to lower consumer income, leads to lower consumer spending, leads to lower revenues for businesses, which causes them to cut even more workers and jobs. And you have kind of this, if you're not allowing deflation to happen in your economy, you're just, people have to get by with less and less money. And if you are allowing deflation, then people are getting by with less and less real spending power, which is, like having less money, but yeah. They're getting by, I said that wrong. They're getting by with less money, which could potentially cause deflation. It doesn't have to if you compensate for the deflation in various ways. People could just be buying less stuff for the same prices. Yeah, anyway. Bad things happen. So then the other direction of this is that why, so we can ask, why was this true in the past that when some jobs were lost, others were created? So there had to be something that wasn't automatic, that was propping up people's incomes. And that could have been, monetary policy, because on your own, more productivity doesn't mean you're going to produce more. It just means you're going to use fewer resources, including labor. So yeah, certainly basic income can be the answer here. You just increase the basic income as productivity increases, people work less, buy more, right? And that's kind of the ideal outcome because you're not tying people's income to their jobs. So the idea that rising production levels can be relied on to provide people more stuff, right? Not necessarily more jobs, but more actual stuff that they can consume, because more production means more consumption, assuming that you're not changing the distribution too much, or that you're not just like producing capital goods for no reason or something like that, but there's actually like stuff that's getting to ordinary people. So I think there's this idea that if you have growth, then it causes good things, but the growth itself depends on consumers having enough income to activate the capacity in the economy. And you can use basic income to do that, but we kind of use other policies to do that. And my sense is that we don't have necessarily as much growth as we would have if we knew that the additional capacity would be activated. Like if we had assurances that consumers had enough money to activate whatever productive capacity we'd build a lot more, because then it's profitable to build more capacity. And then Austin says some of the biggest ghettos and slums are often the product of rural populations losing work as agriculture was mechanized. People moved to the city for work, but then that was automated and offshored too. So we've seen technological unemployment and then populations without spending power that have crises for generations. Yeah, sure. And that was true, even with the Luddites. Like, some people are like, oh, the Luddites were wrong, technology was good. But really, those people were screwed and they never got unscrewed. That was, there were losers in the Industrial Revolution. And the idea, technological unemployment, the fact that we think of that as a bad thing is because people's jobs are tied to their income in the way we've structured our economy right now. In a well-functioning economy, the less work we have to do, the better off everyone is. The more freedom everyone has, so we can kind of bring freedom back into the equation there. So let's see. Yeah, there's more stuff in here about growth. I think an important thing to recognize about basic income is that it's compatible with growth. It's also, and they talk about this in the book, it's also compatible with degrowth, and it's compatible with the economy staying the same size, right? What you really need is just, for whatever level of output your economy is capable of producing, or you want it to produce, people have the money to activate that production. If you have degrowth in a world without basic income, and you're still relying on people's jobs to get them their money, then people's wages are going to go down. Some people are going to lose their jobs, and that's not an even thing, right? Some people are just going to get screwed while other people keep their jobs. There's a distributional problem there. Whereas with basic income, if you want degrowth, you can just lower the level of basic income, and then the economy will produce less. You can't, in order to lower the level of basic income without causing deflation and just getting back to where you started in real terms, you have to use taxes or some other mechanism to conserve resources. So you use the tax to conserve the carbon. You want less carbon emissions, so you tax carbon, and then that lowers the productive capacity of your economy and lowers the natural level of basic income. So that's how you conserve resources in a basic income world, by using some policy to conserve the resource, which causes the basic income to be lower. Yeah. So let's see. More stuff in here about jobs. Let's go to this one. Share screen. The expectation that meaningful work will be lacking easily leads to the conviction that the growing jobless population must be provided with some means of livelihood. But there are two very different ways of fleshing out this conviction, and one of them is very unattractive. It consists of expanding the old model of public assistance, first born in the 16th century and instantiated by today's guaranteed minimum income schemes of a conditional sort. Typically, such programs supplement the income, if any, that poor households gain directly or indirectly from work, up to the point that those households reach some socially defined threshold. So I think, yeah, and I think that's kind of the natural thing to do. If you're trying to compensate for joblessness and people not having incomes for jobs, the natural instinct is to say, oh, this is the problem, we're going to provide some kind of insurance against that, and make it so that people don't suffer too much when they lose their jobs, or help them adjust and that kind of thing. If you're thinking about the problem from this perspective, the most natural thing is to have this kind of targeted thing. Oh, there are these people who are experiencing this problem. We need to help them, get through it, right? So I think that's, when you're approaching basic income from this angle, or when you're approaching trying to have jobs and they get their money from jobs, and that's what's normal, then you come to these solutions that aren't basic income. And when you try to propose basic income as a solution to this kind of thing, it doesn't feel as natural, because it doesn't feel like it's addressing that specific problem functioning economy. And then you won't have to kind of compare it against social assistance programs or something like that. So let's move further down. Yeah, so here's one that's a little bit problematic, and it relates to the rest of the book. Higher levels can be ethically justified in Chapter 5, and that lower levels are politically expedient in Chapter 7. So it's interesting because what is the optimal level of basic income? Does it have anything to do with ethics? Does it have any important things to consider when thinking about what the best level of basic income for the economy is? The question is, what level of basic income allows the economy to work efficiently? Political expedience is important. If you want to kind of get your foot in the door with a policy like this, you need to have something that can actually be enacted. So that's a reasonable point. You know, maybe the basic income would be lower than the optimal level for the economy because, well, you want to get a basic income going. So that's an important point. The ethically just, like you can justify it ethically, therefore it's politically more palatable or something that can come on ethical grounds. But really, you know, the question is what level of consumer spending can the economy handle, and then what's the most efficient mechanism to get that money into consumers' hands? You don't want to overemploy people. You don't want to overstimulate the financial sector. So it's really, basic income is about a choice of mechanisms of how we get people their money. And if you're not doing basic income, then you're doing more of something else that's perhaps less efficient or more damaging. So that's kind of how I think about it. Yeah, go ahead.
Isn't there a certain point at which you could start to make other more nuanced choices? Like, well, one example is your point about carbon taxes, like potentially decreasing the amount of basic income. But there might be others that are like redistributive, like taxing certain things or like taxing the consumption of things that wealthy people tend to buy a lot, so you can give people more basic income, or you know, like things that aren't so clear, right? That like are really about values or priorities in terms of where the resources are going to go. Or like how much government spending is on other projects, right? Versus like basic income. There are tons of these kinds of trade-offs that like once you, I guess put it another way, there's like maybe an optimal level, as you often point out, holding everything else like constant, but then there are other choices you could make that would have a big influence on the basic income that you could afford. And those seem like less obvious choices.
Yeah, there's choices you can make about that would affect the level of basic income the economy can handle. One of those choices is, you know, how many resources does the government want to allocate directly to provide services for the population? And the more resources the government uses for the public purpose, the fewer resources are left to the market and the less basic income you can have. And then there are, yeah, like you said, there are other things you can do, like maybe make it so that rich people aren't using as many resources, and then that increases the level of basic income the economy can sustain. So I think maybe there's two separate questions to ask. There's a question of, well, if you want the market to allocate resources, what's the most efficient mechanism to get people their money? And then how do we make resources more available to the market, and under what conditions would we want to make those resources more available to the market so they can be allocated to ordinary consumers? And that's less of a question about basic income and more, I mean, certainly it works better if you have a basic income. So there's the question of what mechanism you want to use to get people their money, and then there's a question of how do you free up resources for the market? Yeah. So let's go to the next one. The main argument in favor of in-kind provisions is that it increases the likelihood that resources will provide for basic necessities for all members of the household rather than be wasted on luxuries or worse. The same argument is the motivation behind special forms of currency often used to provide minimum income, such as food stamps and other earmarked vouchers. The fact that there is greater public support for in-kind poor relief focused on health and the necessities of life than for blank checks reflects widespread concern that money will not be spent responsibly. So I think, again, these concerns come from thinking about basic income as solving these kind of specific targeted problems, or many different specific problems where it solves a more fundamental problem. Like, basic income isn't even about poor relief, right? It's about efficient distribution of money. The economy is a giant anti-poverty machine, I like to say. And when when the way we get people their money is broken, then you have poverty and you have all these other problems. So, and then the question of, is the money going to be spent, responsibly? That's, why do we care, right? If we're thinking about, okay, what mechanism is efficient for getting people their money, well, it's money, right? People spend it however they want. Basic income is not an alternative to welfare programs. It's an alternative to jobs. It's an alternative to using the labor market and the financial sector as a tool for pushing money to consumers. I think, certainly in this book, I haven't, read the whole thing, but I think they're not thinking about, for the most part, thinking about the macroeconomic effects of basic income, which is really, I think, the most fundamental thing about basic income is that, it's at the level of the whole economy that its effects are seen. So if you're, the fact that I think a lot of basic income proponents talk about basic income as being in this category of thing, like social assistance or government benefit programs or something like that. And I think the fact that we're even putting it in these categories makes it harder to argue for it in simple terms. And I think they fall into this trap in this book because they're really kind of comparing it to welfare states and safety nets and that kind of thing, whereas it's really something more fundamental than that. Yeah, go ahead, Chance.
Yeah, so I think I got video too here, but oh, it's blocked. No, I listened to your podcast last week with Max Jennis, and I don't remember who it was. It was one of you guys that were saying that, like, I think Max was comparing it safety net programs to basic income, and I think you were trying to, point out that that's the wrong way to sort of think about it. But you kind of came to the same, he kind of came to agree with you when you framed the purpose of the economy in terms of like universal welfare in the first place or something like that. And so, when you're saying basic income is the tool to provide resources to citizens, to bolster the economy and the marketplace, I guess I'm still kind of, it's hard for me to imagine that is aligned with my own, goals such as freedom and the other things that I want out of the economy, unless the economy is doing some sort of function of, my interests and stuff like that. It's performing some sort of social welfare task.
Yeah. So what you're getting at is that when we think of the economy as an anti-poverty machine or as a welfare machine, you're worried that the terms welfare and anti-poverty will be kind of associated with these safety net programs. Is that kind of what you're getting at, or these social insurance programs?
I guess you were saying that, you've been saying that basic income, the purpose of it is to just like get money to people efficiently, basically.
Yeah.
But in a way, when we talk about the broader picture of like what we want out of the economy, like, I guess I just don't, I'm being very inarticulate here. I apologize. That makes sense to me, but then it's like, why do I care how efficient the market is unless it's providing for me in terms of social welfare as basically.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That's why you care about how efficient the market is, because the economy is a machine that's providing for people's prosperity. The less efficient it is, the less prosperous the people are going to be.
Okay, so that's kind of just the picture of the economy for you in general, right? So that's why I should care about how efficient the economy is, just because it does, in a way, it does circle back to this welfare sort of consideration, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so the term efficiency in economics is going to refer to, well, how many inputs are you going to use to get the output that you're getting? So your output is social welfare, is benefit to consumers, right? And then your input is whatever resources go into that. So you want to get the maximum benefit, the maximum prosperity for the people with the minimum of labor and materials and capital and other resources.
Yeah,
that's efficiency. Good. Yeah. Okay, let's go to the next one here. Oh, we just did that one. Oh no, we didn't do that one. There we go. Oh wait, did we just do this one? Yes, we did just do this one. Let me fix that. Okay, so if the aim is the eradication of poverty, the universal character of basic income added to its individual nature might make it look at first glance like a pathetic waste of resources. To understand the strength of this objection, define the poverty gap as the volume of transfers required to lift the income of poor households up to the poverty line. The target efficiency of an anti-poverty program is commonly measured by the proportion of the program's expenditure that contributes to closing this gap. A conditional minimum income scheme that strictly targets the poorest by making up the difference between their income and the poverty line is bound to be more efficient in this sense than a basic income, which seemingly wastes valuable resources by distributing them to countless households above the poverty line. So after this, they kind of go into some arguments about how the people identified as poor, that group does not perfectly line up with the group of people who are actually poor, and the people who have the resources to navigate, some of these programs are not the ones who need them the most. And I think, there are, those are big problems. But I think, a bigger problem here again is the framing that the aim is the eradication of poverty. The aim isn't the eradication of poverty. The aim is a properly functioning economy, and poverty is just a side effect of the economy being broken, just like the lack of freedom is a side effect of the economy being broken. So I think again here, when you make these kinds of arguments, or when you bring up this kind of stuff, you're falling into the trap of talking about basic income within the existing paradigm of how the economy works, or how people expect the economy to work today. Yeah, go ahead, Bethany.
Yeah, I like this framing of this counter argument to basic income. Or I think he does a nice job doing it.
Yeah.
And maybe you can talk a little bit more about why the economy works better with a flat amount given to everybody, as opposed to something more just targeted towards the people with less.
Yeah, so it's important to compare basic income to the overall income distribution system. So that means everything we're doing to boost wages through the labor market and boost employment, through stimulating the financial sector and all of that. It's not an apples to apples comparison to compare basic income to targeted programs, right? That kind of support people who aren't getting their money through the normal system. These programs exist because the normal system is leaving some people behind. Basic income is a solution for fixing the normal system. It's not to help people who aren't making it in the economy or something like that.
But I guess I could say, why not replace the whole normal system with something similar to basic income, but that has like some kind of inverse graduation, where like the less money you make, the more you get, and it tapers off at some point.
Well, then there's still an expectation that there's a lot of reasons why not to do that. In terms of efficiency, and people's incomes might be volatile, and how do you qualify? But let's say you could do it perfectly efficiently. You could tell what everyone's income is, and the answer is still has to do with this idea that the expectations are that people get their money through jobs. In a basic income world, if you have basic income as the normal way that people get their money, then the only purpose of wages would be to provide an incentive over and above that. So to say like, oh, your wages are very high, you don't need as much basic income, that kind of undermines the purpose of wages as an incentive in an efficient, if you actually had an efficient labor market, which you could with a basic income. So yeah, I mean, if you have an efficient labor market, then the wages are what they need to be to provide efficient incentives. So if you are providing people with high wages less basic income, you're essentially taking away from their wages and interfering with the efficient incentives that wages provide. Does that make sense?
Gotcha.
Yeah. So let's see. I think I want to do one or two more. Let's do. Yeah, okay, well, here he talks about, or they talk about the difference between a safety net and a floor. So basic income provides a floor for people to stand on rather than catching people when they fall out of the economy. I think that's a good analogy. But I want to get to this next quote here, which is actually something that has come up a lot in our discussions. So the net effects of these opposing forces on the average level of labor compensation and the overall level of employment cannot be predicted. So here they're saying you can't really answer the question of, in a basic income world, are people's wages going to be higher or lower? And the point is that, oh, well, for desirable work, wages are going to go down. For undesirable work, you have to pay people more to get them to do that. I think that part is true. But you can answer this question if you look at it from a more macroeconomic perspective. If you're saying, okay, in order for consumers to buy stuff, to activate economic output, they need a source of income. How much of that income is coming from wages? How much of that income is coming from basic income? If you increase the basic income, that allows you to shrink the wages and allows the aggregate wages to be lower and more efficient. So I think, you know, Eddie disagrees with me on this sometimes, Eddie Chu, but I think, you know, you'd see lower wages overall. That's not to say like per job, each job is paid less, but the aggregate wages that people receive is going to be lower in a basic income world because we're no longer overstimulating the labor market to keep people employed. We're no longer boosting wages for the purpose of providing people income. That's what basic income substitutes for. Yeah, go ahead, Bethany.
Could you, I think someone made this point before, but couldn't you see average pay per time go up and aggregate wages go down because people are working fewer hours, or like a bunch of people are working not at all?
Yeah, so that's where it starts to get complicated. So my default instinct is not to try to answer that question. I think it's complicated. I think the aggregate wages are going to go down. I think it's tricky to, you know, draw these lines between what counts as labor time and what counts as leisure time. You know, what counts as a job, what doesn't count as a job. Obviously, in our world, you know, we have legal distinctions between when you're at work and when you're not at work, and you can calculate how much you're being paid per hour. But in a basic income world, you might not even be able to make those calculations anymore because people might not think of labor and leisure in the same way. There might not be a clear distinction between one kind of time and another kind of time. Everyone has 24 hours in a day, and then everyone in aggregate is getting paid a certain amount in wages. And I think you can confidently say that that aggregate number is going to be lower when people are getting a higher proportion of their income from basic income. So I'll end with that thought. There's more in here about this chapter, a lot more about involuntary unemployment and stuff like that. I really think, you know, the framing it as the problem of involuntary unemployment kind of adds some friction to really making a good argument about basic income. It's not about the labor market. It's only about the labor market in the sense that we're using the labor market instead of a basic income for certain purposes. But we don't care about the level of employment. We don't care about the level of unemployment. We care about the level of benefit that consumers receive as beneficiaries of the economy. So this is a good discussion. Next week, we're doing chapter 2. Which is entitled Basic Income and Its Cousins. So we'll learn about basic income and some of the kind of alternatives out there that are in the same vein, but not quite the same thing. Okay, thanks everybody. I'm gonna go ahead and end the stream.